Okay, in the last part of Chapter 9, we're talking about how both glycolysis and the citric acid cycle are huge intersections for a variety of different metabolic, catabolic, and anabolic pathways, right? So if a cell needs a lot more energy, it can use its proteins, its carbohydrates, its fats as a source of fuel. And this is in fact exactly what our bodies do, right? You turn to your blood sugar first, your glucose. That gets used up. When that gets used up, you turn to your glycogen stores. When your body uses that up, then it turns to your long-term energy reserves, or your fats, right? This is all of our goals when we exercise, to burn that excess fat. In severe starvation mode, when you've used up all of your carbohydrates, all of your fats, this is where your body turns to your proteins. This is when you start to literally eat away at your muscles, because proteins can be used as a form of energy. And so to keep the body alive, the body will essentially take all that muscle composition and use those proteins as a source of energy. Now, what if the opposite is true? What if you have plenty of ATP, but your cells are actively building materials? They don't have enough building supplies. What the cells can do is effectively reverse that entire process. So instead of funneling proteins and carbs and fats into cellular respiration, now we can take all those different intermediates from glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, and the citric acid cycle and funnel them out of cellular respiration and use them as the building molecules to build other components like proteins, like other carbohydrates, and like fats, right? So the body uses these small molecules that it siphons away from cellular respiration to build other substances. And these small molecules technically really come from your food, right? From glycolysis, then from the citric acid cycle, even from pyruvate oxidation. And the proteins, the fats, the carbohydrates, this is what builds cells, tissues, organs, and then eventually the whole entire organism, right? So it's a very dynamic system. Things flow in when you need ATP, when you have plenty of ATP, but you want to build, and then material flows out of cellular respiration to build your proteins, fats, carbohydrates, cells, tissues, organs, etc. All right, the last thing that we really need to talk about is regulation, right? So how do you regulate this incredibly complicated process of cellular respiration? And we're going to come back to our feedback, our theme of feedback inhibition, right? A great way for a cell to regulate a process is to have the end output of that process feedback to the beginning and either enhance or stop the process that created it. So for example, if ATP concentration begins to drop, the cell is doing a lot of active work and it's using up that ATP like crazy, that's going to sort of feed back and enhance the process itself. Or, if there's plenty of ATP around, the cell doesn't need to waste its resources to make more, then that large amount of ATP will feed back and stop or slow down the process of cellular respiration to make sure the cell doesn't make too much ATP when it really doesn't need any more. And this control of the process of catabolism, cellular respiration, is basically performed by regulating various enzymes at key steps within cellular respiration. So let's take a look at an example. Now, I mentioned that you don't have to memorize any of the steps of glycolysis or the citric acid cycle. There is one that I want you to keep close tabs on, and this is because this is essentially the step that is mainly used in regulating cellular respiration. So think back to glycolysis and think back to the first or energy investment phase of glycolysis. There was one step in there, the third step, where we're taking fructose 6-phosphate, so 6 carbons and 1 phosphate, and we add another phosphate to the opposite end of that 6-carbon molecule to end up with 6 carbons and a phosphate on either end. This molecule is fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. The enzyme that catalyzes the addition of that second phosphate group is phosphofructokinase, and this enzyme is highly regulated in the process of cellular respiration. And it's regulated in multiple different ways. So first of all, ATP here. If ATP levels get really high, ATP itself can feed back onto phosphofructokinase, and it will inhibit the enzyme. If it inhibits this enzyme, it stops glycolysis there, and the rest of the process doesn't take place. Also, citric acid cycle, right? The first molecule that's produced at the beginning of the citric acid cycle is citrate. This is how we get the name, the citric acid cycle, right? This is when the 2-carbon acetyl group gets joined with that 4-carbon oxaloacetate to form that 6-carbon citrate. If citrate levels get really, really high, citrate again can feed back and inhibit phosphofructokinase. This regulation helps to balance glycolysis and the citric acid cycle so one doesn't run away from the other one. So let's say, for example, the citric acid cycle can't keep up with the amount of acetyl-CoA that's going into the citric acid cycle, and the citrate starts to build up. The citrate will then feed back to glycolysis saying, hey, glycolysis, slow down because we can't keep up downstream. So it slows the process down until citric acid cycle can keep up, right? So it kind of helps to balance the two main processes of cellular respiration that participate in glucose degradation. Okay, so those are both inhibitory pathways. There is one green arrow, there is one green arrow here, right? So now think about ATP for a second. ATP has 3 phosphates. You take off one phosphate, you're left with ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. You take off one more phosphate, then you're left with AMP, or adenosine monophosphate. So if you've completely extracted all that energy from ATP, and you've gone from having a lot of ATP now to having a lot of AMP in the cell, adenosine monophosphate, if you have a lot of AMP, you probably don't have much ATP left. So as AMP levels in the cell go up, this tells cellular respiration, hey, we're depleted of ATP, we need to start making some more. So AMP can actually stimulate phosphofructokinase, turning on this process, and the rest of cellular respiration then will increase ATP production because the cell is lacking in ATP. All right, folks, and that's it for Chapter 9.